You're listening to a debate on the future of ride-hailing in Austin, hosted by KUT News and the Austin Monitor. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Nathan Bernier with KUT News. I'm one of your moderators tonight. I'm joined by KUT News reporter Audrey McGlinchey. Hello, Audrey.
Hello, Nathan.
And Caleb Pritchard, reporter with the Austin Monitor. Hey, Caleb.
Hey, what's going on?
So we're going to introduce our debate panel in a moment, but first a look at how we got to where we are today. Before any ride-hailing apps operated in Austin, we had a taxi system that failed to meet demand on Friday and Saturday nights and during special events such as South by Southwest and Austin City Limits. The city commissioned a study in 2011 highlighting those problems and calling for an additional 100 taxi permits. More permits were issued. The problems persisted. Uber entered the market during South by Southwest in 2013 and Lyft followed shortly thereafter. Both operated outside city regulations. Fines were issued, cars were impounded, but the city could not force the companies to stop. So in 2014, Austin City Councilmember Chris Riley crafted what he characterized as a temporary solution.
So I'm proposing a way to legalize services like Uber and Lyft now through operating agreements. In order to qualify for an operating agreement, these app companies will have to meet certain criteria,
such as insurance and being upfront about fares and driver background checks. The Austin City Council adopted the rules in late 2014, but not everyone was happy with them. Taxis, shuttles, and limousines had a much stricter set of guidelines. They called the rules unfair. When the new city council came in last year, it decided to adopt a set of permanent rules. And the most controversial among them, from Uber and Lyft's point of view, was the move toward fingerprint-based background checks. Both companies do background checks, just not based on a driver's fingerprints. City Councilmember Ann Kitchen is head of the city's mobility committee.
With regard to fingerprint-based background checks, I'd just like to point out that both the FBI and the Texas Department of Public Safety agree that fingerprinting is the best way to ensure that the records reviewed belong to the person being checked, with a match accuracy rate of 99.6%.
Uber and Lyft say they cannot operate under those rules because fingerprint checks are too burdensome and prevent them from signing up drivers quickly, undermining their business model. Here's Lyft Representative April Mims speaking to the Austin City Council.
In case it's unclear, we do not operate in any city that requires a mandatory fingerprint for our peer-to-peer platform.
Now, through the Ride-Sharing Works for Austin group, Uber and Lyft hired people to gather enough signatures to get an ordinance on the ballot on May 7th. This ordinance closely resembles the one adopted in 2014 with a few changes. A vote for Proposition 1 is a vote for the ordinance supported by Uber and Lyft. A vote against is for the regulations passed by the City Council in December, including fingerprinting drivers. Now, of course, the fingerprint checks are not the only issue tonight. We're going to get to a bunch of other issues, so let's do that. We'll introduce our panelists. First, I have to say, we did request representatives from Uber and Lyft and members of the Austin City Council to join us. Both declined our invitation, but we've got representatives from the two main political action committees working on this issue. Arguing in favor of Proposition 1, from Ride-Sharing Works for Austin, we have Huey Ray Fisher and Joe Bowen. Arguing against Proposition 1, from the Our City, Our Safety, Our Choice Political Action Committee, Laura Morrison and Dean Rindy. Let's give our panelists a round of applause, please. Both sides will have 1 minute to make an opening statement and 2 minutes to make a closing statement, and we're going to ask some questions and give them each a minute to respond, and our audience has been invited to ask questions by writing them on cards. We've asked our audience to refrain from applause or booing, and we flipped a coin to decide who would make the first opening statement, and that went to Ride-Sharing Works for Austin. So go ahead, you have 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those of you that were able to join us tonight. My name is Joe Bowen. I'm the Outreach Director for Ride-Sharing Works for Austin, and I'm really glad that we have the opportunity to speak with all of you today and everyone who's listening to this on KUT. Obviously, this is an incredibly unique election in Austin, but the most fundamental thing that I want everyone to keep in mind tonight is that voting for Proposition 1 on May 7th is a vote to keep ride-sharing operating here in Austin with the same regulations that have worked for the past 2 years. Those regulations didn't just happen by accident. Our city council worked extremely hard for several months, not only with Uber and Lyft, but also with stakeholders from shuttle services and the taxi industry to craft a safe, reliable method of transportation that has met the needs of hundreds of thousands of passengers here in Austin. It is incredibly important to the future of transportation in this city and our public safety that we vote for Proposition 1 on May 7th to continue safe transportation options in Austin.
Thank you. Our city, our safety, our choice. Go ahead.
Thank you, and it's great to be here. It's a great turnout. I appreciate this. And let me make clear from the very beginning, this is not about whether you like Uber and Lyft. What this is about is a critical question: who is going to control our city? Citizens or corporations that are looking out for their own self-interest. These are multi-billion-dollar corporations funding a multi-million-dollar campaign to prohibit the city of Austin from being able to require fingerprints when fingerprints have been identified and recommended as a critical public safety standard. Uber does fingerprints in Houston. Uber does fingerprints in New York City. And I think the people of Austin need to be asking, why are they asking us to compromise public safety standards when they can do it in New York and Houston? So with that, I look forward to the questions.
Councilmember Morrison, you mentioned critical questions, and we want to start with our first one. It's going to be a real doozy, probably on the forefront of everyone's mind here. How did each one of you get here tonight? Councilmember Morrison, you
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
have precedence.
Yeah, well, you mean physically, specifically?
What means of conveyance did you arrive here?
Conveyance. Okay, because I was going to say, well, it's a long story of my life. Yes, I got here, I drove.
Despite the appearance of a generational split up here, I voted for Bernie. I just want you to know. And I drove my car here tonight.
I took an Uber.
My bicycle is outside. It's the one with the wooden helmet.
All right,
He would really like that wooden helmet to be there when we're done.
all right, so let's just get this out of the way. If Prop 1 fails on the May 7th vote, will Uber and Lyft leave Austin?
Ride sharing works for Austin.
I think we should take them for the word that they will leave. They've left every city where they said they would leave if fingerprint-based background checks were mandated. We saw that in Midland, we saw that in Corpus Christi, we saw that in Galveston. The other side would like to point out Houston as an example, but Uber never said they would leave Houston, and they remained. Lyft did leave, and it's the 4th largest city in the United States. The reason they're operating in New York is because they're not transportation network companies up there. It's a totally different system, so it's not even applicable to this debate. In Houston, we see surge pricing going through the roof with Uber because they're having trouble getting drivers onto the road. And they have less drivers for Uber in Houston than they do here in Austin, and Houston's a way larger city with a way more affluent market. So I think we should take that very seriously, that it's not just about cost. There's something very fundamentally wrong with fingerprint-based background checks that would push them out of our community, and that is the effects of voting against Prop 1.
Well, it's pure speculation on what they'll do. A number of observers, including somebody who wrote an op-ed in the American Statesman the other day, said, no, they're not going to leave big markets like this. My personal theory is Uber's fighting this fight everywhere in America. The city of Los Angeles just petitioned the California Public Service Board to allow them to require fingerprinting in Uber and Lyft cars. I think the objective of Uber and Lyft in this campaign is try to teach other cities a lesson. They're fighting this battle in Boston. They're fighting it in Newark. And they only have a limited amount of time to establish a monopoly or oligopolistic position where they can raise prices. They've got to win this fight. And that's what really is sparking these threats, I think. We don't really know what they're going to do. They haven't left New York, and they haven't left Houston.
And if I could just add, there were 15
you got 15 seconds.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I hope they don't leave, but if they do leave, it's been proven that it is a lucrative market if you believe in supply and demand, and I know that there are smaller TNCs that are operating, and I believe that they'll come in, scale up, and we'll have the service.
All right, next question first to our city, our safety, our choice. If Uber and Lyft do pull out of Austin, should Prop 1 be rejected, how could the council revisit its rules? Should it revisit the rules, assuming that they do pull out? What then?
Well, as I said, I think that I know that there are other that are in operation here already. There are, one of the things that's one of the issues about TNCs is that labor has real concerns about the way the drivers are being treated. And so there's one startup that called Juno that actually has an equity stake for the drivers. So I think you're going to see a real evolution of TNCs, and we can hope that there'll be plenty of opportunity for the city to really step up and help make that grow.
It's like saying a grocery chain isn't going to work here because we have certain food service standards or public health standards. Corporations have an obligation to serve the public and maintain public safety. Once people understand that they're not going to be allowed in an unsafe manner in the metropolitan areas of the United States, you're going to see a response from the market, and they're going to serve.
You guys have 1 minute to respond. Ride Sharing Works for Austin has 1 minute to respond.
We're going to get into the merits and flaws of fingerprint-based background checks and how they're awful. But what we should note here is that my job is not to defend Uber and Lyft. My job is to defend ride sharing and the ordinance that's on the ballot. And what's critical to note is, if GetMe and other entities want to come into the market and agree with the false sense of security provided by fingerprint-based background checks, that's totally chill. I don't care because I'm for ride sharing in general because it gets my friends home safely at night.
We believe that options are good, whether it's more competitors in the ride sharing space or it's an improved public transit system, which we also desperately need here in Austin. The important thing that I think we should all consider is that we deserve to have the 10,000 options that we already have providing safe rides on our street, and that's why we need to vote for Prop 1 to keep ride sharing here in Austin.
And I would just like to serve a warning to GetMe and those other companies that if you start complying with these regulations, the taxi cab companies are going to come after y'all because y'all are still going to be their competition.
For Ride Sharing Works, why do Uber and Lyft claim that their background checks are actually better than any required by the city? And what do those checks actually entail?
I believe you're referring to the California issue, and if you look at the statements that Uber and Lyft released, they voluntarily agreed to cease referring to those background checks as better. We all know that there is no such thing as a perfect background check. I think the reason why we're here today is because we have some fundamental disagreements that fingerprint-based background checks are effective. They've been proven to be discriminatory of several important communities of color here in Austin, and I think that as the first southern city to enact second chance hiring practices, we need to be very careful about how we proceed here because fingerprint-based background checks only check whether or not you've been arrested. They make no effort to tell whether or not you've been convicted of a crime. They make no effort to tell whether or not you were wrongly arrested. And I think that as Austinites, we all need to be very honest with each other that that is a serious problem that we have. People do get arrested for the wrong reason here in Austin, and disproportionately, it is young people, it is poor people, and it is especially people of color.
Yeah, I think it's really important to know that there are hard numbers that show that fingerprint checks are really important because the fact of the matter is there is no way to confirm a person's identity without a biometric, without fingerprints. And that's why they're so important. That's why they're recommended by law enforcement. DOJ came out with some reports, various reports that show that, that they have a 99.6% reliability, I think, compared to other kinds of non-biometric background checks that have only an 88%. That's a significant difference. I think if the council was trying to impose something that would take you from, 99 to 99.1, that's a fair discussion, but this is a very significant difference.
I think it's interesting that he quoted the California lawsuit. You should be aware that they were sued by the district attorneys of San Francisco and Los Angeles for falsely misleading the public about the safety of their background checks, their non-fingerprint background checks.
And we'll keep getting into background checks for sure. We have several more questions about those. So now for our safety, our city. I'm sorry.
Our city, our safety, our
Thank
choice.
you, Nathan. So you touched on this briefly, but what evidence is there that fingerprint-based background checks are any better than the ones conducted by Uber and Lyft? And is there evidence that these fingerprint-based background checks actually make anyone safer? And I will note that hopefully in your response, Ride Sharing Works, you can get into what actually goes on in those background checks, because you didn't have time to answer that in the first one. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that there is some evidence, and the settlement that came out, or the reports that came out about the California lawsuit recently, you can read in the Statesman this morning some really amazing misses, but that weren't caught because they didn't have background checks. For instance, one miss was somebody that had been convicted of second-degree murder, and he was missed because he was using an alias. Somebody that was convicted of kidnapping was missed because they didn't bother to go check Los Angeles, and that's where it was recorded. So, you know, while they may claim to be national in scope, they only go to certain places to check the record. So I think that it's very clear that there's evidence.
May I just say, this is not a debate about what is 100% effective. It's a debate about doing everything you can to make your system as safe as possible. That's why the FBI and the Texas DPS and the Austin Police and the Los Angeles District Attorney all said background checks should include fingerprinting.
Thank you.
They make it safer.
Thank you. Ride-sharing works for Austin. Your response?
The first and one of the most important things that I want to point out in this discussion is that the fingerprint background check-based system that we've used for other methods of transportation in Austin up until last Thursday has only checked your Texas criminal history. So I'm not exactly sure how it is more damaging that someone had something slip in Los Angeles when we don't take the effort to see whether or not you've been convicted of a crime in Oklahoma or Louisiana before we let you drive a taxi.
And also the background check system that Uber and Lyft uses is very comprehensive. It goes into all 50 states, it checks sex offender registries, it checks the terrorism watch list. It's something that I trust, and it's something that a lot of people who use Uber and Lyft trust, and that's why they get into the vehicles with strangers, because they know that this is a mandatory background check that those drivers had to go through before getting into that car.
Thanks. And guys, I know it's a really passionate issue and it's difficult to refrain, but if you could please refrain from applause or booing as much as possible. Okay, Uber, for our city, our safety, our choice. Uber operates in Houston. Fingerprint-based background checks are required for drivers. Lyft does not operate in Houston for that reason. So why, in the case of Uber, do fingerprint-based background checks, sorry, this is for you guys. Let me try that again. Why, in the case of Uber, do fingerprint-based background checks not work in Austin if they already work in Houston? For ride-sharing works for Austin.
So I can't speak on behalf of Uber or Lyft. I work for the PAC, and I'm here to defend the ordinance on the books, and I'm also here to defend ride-sharing in general. But let's look at what's going on in Houston. Lyft left, and it's the 4th largest city in the United States. If Lyft and Uber are out there to make money, which I believe they are, they wouldn't be leaving town just to throw a temper tantrum when there's money on the table. Uber stayed in Houston. They never said they would leave, yet we see it hurting their bottom line, and we see these unnecessary regulations that provide a false sense of security, setting up a precedent for taxi cab companies to come in and ask for even more onerous regulations. So we see surge pricing going through the roof. They don't have as many drivers in Houston as they do here in Austin, which is ridiculous.
I also want to point out that the background check system that Uber and Lyft use, they use in 200 cities in the United States of America. Picking out the 2 where they don't really doesn't provide me much comfort.
Thank you. All right, our city, our safety, our choice. You have a minute to respond to that.
Thank you. Let me just start real fast and say I just want to follow up because the question of what kind of things changed last Thursday, it was clear that in 2014, that we had a lot of work to do to align the different regulations for different ground transportation systems. And it is not true that everybody was on board, that everybody, the taxis and everybody had worked and brought this together. It was a contentious issue. This was an interim ordinance, and there was lots more work to do.
Well, I'm glad that you approve of the national background checks, because that's what the council enacted a week or 2 ago in order to make it as strong as it could possibly be. If we pass Prop 1, that will go away. I hope it doesn't disappoint you too much, Joe. But
I'm sorry, but one of the fundamental points...
Sorry, Joe, hold on there. You'll have a chance to, you'll get a minute in a second.
I'm sorry.
And if I could,
You got 2 seconds.
well, if I could just have 10 seconds to say, in fact, in 2014, we envisioned looking at how do we align the different kinds of background checks, and the fact that it was only Texas that the taxis were subject to needed to be fixed, and I'm glad they did. It's exactly what we had asked them to do.
And we will have more time on that because our next question is exactly that. The city required national background checks for ride-hailing companies since 2014, but only recently made that a requirement for taxi cabs roughly 2 weeks ago. If strong background checks are so important, why has the city not required them to be national in scope for taxi cabs until very recently? For our city, our safety, our choice.
Okay, well, and I can tell you that in 2014, we knew it wasn't done. You heard Chris Riley on the intro talking about how this was a temporary thing. There are explicit things in the 2014 ordinance that say, go and find ways to align these and to make it better. We knew that there was work to be done. This council has come in and they did their job now. If you're asking why it took them 11 months to do their job, they had a lot going on. And there was a lot of discussion, and I'm proud of them for upping the standards to make it consistent.
Well, it's not about mistakes made in the past. It's about what's been done to rectify them. They moved to rectify it, and the ordinance is much stronger now. And the effect of Prop 1 will be to take it away, and in fact, forbid fingerprinting in the future.
Right, Sharon?
You know, it's really troubling to me to hear someone say, we knew that this didn't get done in 2014, and we didn't do anything to fix it until February of 2016, when we're talking about an issue that is so germane to our safety as a public. There is no reason why we should be attacked for wanting one set of rules for ourselves and another set for everyone else, when we were the ones who were told we needed to play by different rules. And both of the people who are speaking on behalf of the opposition campaign have just said that they knew that it was not equitable. And I want that to sink in for a moment because that's a pretty fundamentally important thing that we all need to keep in mind.
And if this were a sincere conversation about public safety, fingerprint-based background checks are fundamentally flawed and discriminatory, and I would argue outdated. And more than that, if we wanted to talk about public safety, we would mandate that cab companies have to use the same technologies Uber and Lyft do to keep passengers safe.
Going back to the California settlement, this would be for my friends over on the ride-sharing work side. When you look at the settlement Uber signed with the DAs in LA and San Francisco last week, does that make it more difficult to believe claims about the strength of Uber and Lyft's current background check system?
I don't believe so because, as I said earlier, we all have to acknowledge that there's no such thing as a perfect background check. The reason why I feel comfortable voting for Prop 1, and I'm proudly advocating that we vote for Prop 1, is that these companies are still very new. And when these issues come up, they work aggressively to change their approach. They've done it in this case, and they also did it in a really unfortunate case in Chicago that some folks talk about, where a husband stuck his picture into his wife's Uber account and began driving her car. Since that happened, Uber began to actually have a human being verify that the photo on your driver's license matches the photo that's in your profile. Things like that are made possible by innovative technology, and that's what we're really talking about here. These are new companies that are doing incredible things with technology.
And let's note that California regulates ride-sharing, and they trust the system that Uber and Lyft currently undergo. I encourage everybody to actually read what happened in that lawsuit.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's return to California. Let's remember that the city of Los Angeles is petitioning the state for the right to require fingerprinting in ride-sharing vehicles. And let's return to our friend, the San Francisco District Attorney, who said, because it doesn't fingerprint drivers, Uber's criminal checks are worthless. Quote, the company repeats the misleading logic, giving consumers a false sense of security. I think that answers the question about whether the lawsuits in California reflect upon the claims for safety made here in Texas.
All right.
I'm just going
You
to
have another
follow up
30
because
seconds.
one of the concerns I have, and it was a lot of the lawsuit discussion was about exaggerating claims. And I just want to, I hope we'll have some time to talk about exaggerating claims and misstatements that are being made during the campaign by the pro folks.
Thank you.
Next question. There will definitely be a question about that. So next question, this is for our city, our safety, our choice. The NAACP, the local NAACP chapter came out against fingerprint-based background checks, saying that they discriminate against minorities who are more likely to be arrested but not convicted of a crime. And just for those who aren't familiar, fingerprints are run through the FBI, which rely on reporting from local jurisdictions. So some folks have said if that reporting is delayed, it can, show that someone has been arrested but not convicted of a crime. So, can you respond to that claim that there are flaws in these background checks?
They do, if they do show up as arrests, what I can say is this council is very, very concerned about making sure that things are fairly adjudicated, to make sure that people are fairly treated. And there's lots of discussion going on in the council right now to be able to actually craft how that's all going to happen, to do it in a fair way so that we can have the safety standard that fingerprint background checks bring us, but also do it in a fair way.
There are huge inequities out there. Problems in education are poverty problems, and a lot of these problems would be better solved if we reform the criminal justice system. Marijuana should be legalized. We need to remove racial bias in justice. We need to quit incarcerating black and brown people at a much higher rate than whites. That's the solution. To say the solution is to give the Uber Corporation the right to do whatever it wants is, I think, a misstatement and poor reasoning.
Ride sharing works.
As the only person of color on this stage, I think it's absolutely reprehensible that that somebody would be pushing an agenda for discriminatory fingerprint-based background checks. That's absolutely unacceptable, and those are not our core values in this community. And more importantly, we have to understand that fingerprint-based background checks are flawed. And if council were serious about those issues, they should address them head on.
And I'm glad that what's happening in Los Angeles has come up as part of this conversation, because the state of California doesn't conduct fingerprint background checks. The city is petitioning for the process. Some folks in the city are. But as a state, they believe that the practice is discriminatory as well, and they don't do it in Sacramento or San Diego or San Francisco. And there's a reason why they don't do it. Communities around the country have rejected fingerprint background checks, and as I said, 200 cities in the United States operate ride-sharing services with the background checks Uber and Lyft already use.
All right, we've talked a lot about fingerprint-based background checks, and we're going to move on, but first we're going to take a quick break. We are listening to a debate about Proposition 1, dealing with ride-hailing in Austin, brought to you by KUT News and the Austin Monitor. Stay with us. We'll be right back. All right. Great work. Okay, we're actually not going to take a long break here, but if you all have question cards, can you please hold them up so Matt can gather them? Because we want to make sure that we get to those. Thank you. Matt's gonna gather them, and he's gonna. Hey, Matt. Oh, thank you. Appreciate that.
You're the nice man.
We're only gonna. There's a lot. I know.
Well,
Oh yeah. Do you know where the cards and pencils are? This gentleman here wanted to write one down.
It's turning out to be easier.
You can get to those as soon as you sort them out. We were on 10.
So you grab my question first, that doesn't mean it needs to be on the bottom.
Yeah.
Throw that in there. We're not gonna ask all these. I know, there's no way you can. Just wanna make sure.
So you still got a couple of some questions. So we're gonna go outside so I can see these.
yeah, when people came in,
Yeah. Just bring a bunch and we'll just get through them. All right. Oh yeah. Sure. Awesome. Thank you.
yeah, we'll post the Twitter.
I heard someone in line that was wearing a Lyft t-shirt say, "Oh man, I just made it down here. I just got the call."
It's not so bad. At least we're not getting the need.
I think we're halfway.
We must be.
We started at about such as 6:50.
Okay. Okay, yeah.
So the frustrating thing is, people that want to quarterback when you're up here, it's really hard to do.
Oh, there are people out there.
There are people out here that are like texting me. Oh, this is so funny. This is for failure. We get to adjudicate. I officially. Nothing.
One more.
And this is from David. Saying, forget about that.
All right, we're going to get going here again. I just really needed to grab those comment cards from you. And I'm taking questions here off Twitter. So, all right. Order your drinks and everything, but
It's like Mark showing up at those meetings with all of these things for everybody else to do.
you guys good to resume?
Let's do this.
All right, we're almost halfway through right now. We're going to do like another 35 minutes or so. Matt is, we're just going to ask a few more questions, and then we're going to get to some of y'all's questions. We really appreciate your participation tonight, and we want to get as many of those asked as we can. So I'm going to just, say that we're coming back from our break. Let me think about what am I going to say to figure that out. So let's get back to this. All right. I had my little intro here, actually. You're listening to a live debate on the future of ride-hailing in Austin, hosted by KUT News and the Austin Monitor. We're recording this at the North Door in downtown Austin. We have a live studio audience who's having a great time. I want to reintroduce our panelists in case you're just joining us. Arguing in favor of Proposition 1 from Ride Sharing Works for Austin, we have Huey Ray Fisher and Joe Bowen. Arguing against Proposition 1 from Our City, Our Safety, Our Choice, the Political Action Committee, we have Laura Morrison and Dean Rindy. My next question goes to Our City, Our Safety, Our Choice. Travis County Sheriff has said DWIs dropped more than 20% with the arrival of Uber and Lyft. Now, it's difficult to prove a causal link, but it stands to reason that they're connected. So if these companies do in fact leave because fingerprint-based background checks are required, is it worth DWIs going up because of that? You have 1 minute to respond.
So, yes, there was some data about DWIs going down. I want to say that we've had some folks, some statisticians at UT looking at the numbers because, as you say, correlation, causation, there is a logic to it that people would have another option, which is great, to be able to get home and not drive drunk. But the fact of the matter is, and we'll be working on getting this information out in more detail, there were DWIs going down before Uber and Lyft came, then they went up, and then they went down again, and then they came up again. So I really, really hesitate to say that we can actually make any causation argument at all.
I return to the essential point. Anything that reduces DWIs is good. We don't want Uber to leave. But I'll tell you this. When my teenage daughter is out at a university party and she's been drinking and she wants a safe ride home, I'd like to have some reasonable assurance that her driver isn't a convicted sex offender.
Response from Ride Sharing Works for Austin.
First of all, as we've already pointed out, for the last 2 years, Uber and Lyft have been conducting comprehensive nationwide background checks that include checking public sex offender registries. There's your assurance. Second of all, I remember South by Southwest 2014. I'm sure many of us do. There was a terrible DUI incident that led to a few people dying. We just got through South by Southwest. I don't ever want Austin to go back to that.
So I got involved in this campaign, and I was for Prop 1 before I took this job with Ride Sharing Works for Austin, because ride sharing keeps my friends safe. Before ride sharing got into town, the way we would get home from 6th Street was either you would walk home, which is a 30 to 45 minute walk. You would take the e-bus, which was often overcrowded. It's the free service by Cat Metro. Please use public transportation. Or you would depend on a designated driver who would not have fun that evening, or you would do the unacceptable and get in the car with somebody under the influence behind the wheel. And that culture has changed dramatically, and we have to acknowledge that. This is why this is such a generational fight.
Next question is for Ride Sharing Works. So Uber and Lyft operate in some markets where quote-unquote trade dress is required. For those who aren't familiar, trade dress means a way of identifying the vehicle as an Uber or Lyft vehicle. Lyft's got those pink mustaches, Uber has stickers. That requirement is not part of Prop 1. Why not in Austin? Why not require that?
Because when you apply logic to it, it creates a very false sense of security. So when you hail an Uber or Lyft, you see the name, the photo, the vehicle information, and most importantly, the license plate number of the vehicle that's showing up. And before you get into the vehicle, you have to check and make sure the face matches in your photo matches the driver, and you have to make sure that the license plate number matches the license plate. And that provides a true sense of security. Anybody can fake an emblem, which are essentially stickers, and just slap them onto cars. And we don't want people to be depending on, oh, it has the Lyft sticker, let's get in, and then realize, oh, this isn't our driver. That creates a very dangerous precedent, and it's actually a very regressive measure.
Though I do want to say that I quite like the pink mustaches, so hopefully they keep sending those to their drivers who work very hard for them.
Well, I guess in crazy logic world, we would be advocating none of the safe procedures for Uber. No, throw everything away. Don't have photographs. Don't have anything. Just put this sticker on your car. But in real world, nobody's arguing that. Everybody's saying, yeah, we need all those other safety procedures, and trade dress is good too for a number of good reasons. First of all, it makes it a little bit harder for somebody to fool an innocent victim, and there have been some recently reported. And secondly, it enables police and other people to see when somebody's violating the law by letting people out in a crowded traffic lane, which they're not supposed to do. That's the purpose of it. That's all.
Anything? You have another 20 seconds. All right. We can move on to the next question. Caleb Pritchard from the Austin Monitor.
This is for my friends over at Our City, Our Safety, Our Choice. One major reason that Uber and Lyft were so gosh darn popular in the city of Austin is because when they came here, our taxi system was subpar, to say the least. You couldn't get one on Thursday or Friday or Saturday nights, special events, forget about it. A study commissioned by the city in 2011 said as much. So why should anybody trust the city council's regulations for transit network companies when it couldn't even effectively regulate the taxi service?
I'm not here to defend the taxi people either. I'm not here to defend the principle of limiting taxi licenses, which is what they do in a lot of cities. What I am here to do is to defend the principle that when you get into a stranger's car, you or your children need a reasonable assurance of safety. That's why we want to require vehicle checks. That's why we want to require insurance. That's why we want to require fingerprint background checks. Now, there are other ways to solve those other problems. The fact that the previous system was insufficient, which it was, doesn't mean that we should go to complete anarchy and have no standards at all. We should improve the system and require it of everybody who wants to hire out their car and drive people around. It's just elemental in my feeling.
Ride Sharing Works, your response?
First of all, nobody's advocating for anarchy. We're advocating for sensible and strong regulations that do keep people safe. And the reason young people trust Uber and Lyft is not only because of those regulations, but what Uber and Lyft go above and beyond to do to keep people safe. Before you get in the vehicle, you have the name, the photo, vehicle information of your driver. Once you're on the road, everything's GPS tracked, which is tremendous. So God forbid if something happens, at least you have a record to turn over to the police. That also serves as a deterrent, which is tremendous and should be required for cab companies. And then you can also send an ETA and the destination to your friends to let them know when you're on your way. And then after the ride, even if nothing happened, say the driver was just giving you weird looks, you can report that in the app so that way Uber and Lyft can investigate.
And to Mr. Rindy's point on the prior question, if there are folks out there that are looking for a transportation option that doesn't offer any of those safety features, feel free to call Yellow Cab.
All right. This next question is for Ride Sharing Works for Austin. The Ride Sharing Works for Austin campaign has used some questionable claims, such as help save Uber and Lyft, or vote for Prop 1 to require Uber and Lyft to keep doing criminal background checks. Either way you vote on Prop 1, criminal background checks will be done on drivers. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Absolutely, what you just said. If you vote for Prop 1, you are voting for a system that does comprehensive national background checks on your drivers.
That's
You
not what
are
the statement said,
absolutely
though.
correct.
That's not what it was said
You
in
are
the
absolutely
commercial.
correct that both systems do require background checks. That's absolutely not in dispute. But when you look at the incredibly confusing ballot language on this, it's incredibly possible that you would walk into the voting booth and not know that you are voting for a system that requires national background checks, and both do.
Mr. Rindy just used the word anarchy, and what the ballot language suggests to voters is that by voting for Prop 1, you're taking away regulations, and that's unacceptable. And yes, it is to save Uber and Lyft in this community, because those are the effects of this election. Those are the effects of too many regulations that don't actually work in the public interest.
It's a self-imposed exit, though. That should be clear.
But those are the effects. That's what the regulations do. We can either have a 30-second, ad to let voters know what will happen, or we can have a 45-minute policy discussion. It'll come to the same conclusion.
I really appreciate the question because it's been very frustrating, and I think it's a disservice to the people of Austin, the kind of campaign statements that have been out there with all the almost $2.2 million. In fact, that statement that you mentioned, Audrey, vote for Prop 1 to keep doing criminal background checks, that should be vote against Prop 1 to keep doing fingerprint background checks. So, there's a lot to be questioned about those. Apparently there's another one out there today, or something out there today, and I haven't seen it, but I heard it was in an ad that taxpayers were going to be paying for fingerprint checks. That is not true, and we don't have time to go into the ordinance, but it's not true.
I think our colleagues have a tough time answering that. It's not their fault that the Uber media people did that. But the fact is that the paper addressed it in a couple of different articles. Their ad says, vote for Prop 1 to require Uber and Lyft to keep doing criminal background checks. And as the Austin American pointed out, the fact is Prop 1 would forbid the critical background check of fingerprinting.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
All right. Question for Our City, Our Safety, Our Choice. I'm going to start asking some of these audience questions because we really appreciate them. Here's a question from the audience. Shouldn't the consumer be allowed to decide what level of background check works for them? Right now, they do have the option of taking a taxi if they prefer that level of background check.
Well, this is an issue of consumer protection, and the question is, you need to start the time.
Sorry. No, don't my incompetence.
It's a question of consumer protection, and our elected officials. We've asked them to make those judgments. As I said before, this is a significant difference from 88% reliability to 99.6% reliability. And so there are times when we step in. Think about the food industry. Think about the drug industry. We should not be turning over critical regulations and rules decisions to corporations that are operating and motivated by their own self-interest.
Yeah, I guess you really shouldn't. Hey, it worked so well in the age of the robber barons. Why can't we try it again? Let's just deregulate everything. Obviously, you can debate whether this area has a proper amount of regulation, but the notion that we should leave everything up to consumers means that I have to decide whether this vial of medicine that I buy off the shelf is safe.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Ride sharing.
Why, have you ever heard of the Food and Drug Administration?
Thank you, Mr. Rindy. Ride sharing works for Austin. You have a minute to respond.
I am really glad that the term consumer protection has worked into this discussion, because to me what it means to protect your consumer is letting them know before their ride shows up who is going to be there, what they look like, what car they're driving, what their license plate number is. I believe that consumer protection means providing GPS tracking for every single trip that you give a consumer, which these ride-sharing companies do right now. And I also believe that consumer protection means when you're in a ride-sharing service and you don't feel safe, having the ability to send your tracking information to a friend who can watch in real time and make sure that you arrive where you're supposed to at the end of the night. That's consumer protection, and that's what voting for Prop 1 continues in Austin, and I need to be as clear about that as I possibly can.
Yeah, this is not about regulation versus non-regulation. It's about strong and sensible regulations versus regulations being pushed by the taxi industry to push a modern technology out of our community.
Next question for Ride Sharing Works of Austin. Councilmember Morrison mentioned it earlier, but Uber and Lyft have funded your political action committee with $2.2 million. None of that, all of that is from Uber and Lyft, none of it from local sources, whereas their political action committee has raised around $13,000 or so. All but one donation was from out of town. It's outraged people who say this is an example of corporations trying to buy their own laws. So what do you say to that?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I'm equally disgusted by money in politics. I'm disgusted that money's being thrown on both sides. That taxi cab companies, spent thousands of dollars to, and I'll address it, spent thousands of dollars to lobby our city council. Uber and Lyft could have spent the $2.2 million rather than engaging voters and letting them decide this issue. They could have taken that money straight to council and been really heavy-handed there. I'm not a fan of corporate money in politics, but we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater here and impose poor public policies just for the sake of petty politics.
And to go a step further, I'll go back to the language that you're going to be looking at on your ballot. It is written in a way that to me reads to be extremely confusing, and that is an opinion that is shared by literally every person that I have spoken to on the topic. They've made the investment because it is important that voters know what they are actually voting for, and they care about keeping tens of thousands of great economic opportunities for people who are trying to bridge the affordability gap here in Austin.
Thank you.
For $2.2 million, they could have done tens of thousands of fingerprints. It seems like that would have been a lot better use of their time. And this fantasy about the taxi industry is somehow the massive puppet master behind all these people is really sort of stunning. You need to start the clock, Nathan.
I'm going to get fired.
I'm really
here
honest,
if
and I just noticed that. And it's because when you look at all of the endorsing organizations to vote against Prop 1, you've got labor organizations, you've got the Sierra Club, you have the Travis County Democratic Party, you have women who are seriously concerned about safety in their transportation options. And we're not talking about an either or. It's important to have layers of safety, and fingerprints add a really critical layer of safety.
Thank you.
Let me return to this consumer protection. Nobody's saying that it's all or nothing. If we have airbags, we can't have safe brakes.
Thank you.
We're saying let's add another layer of protection.
Thank you, sir.
So I'll throw this one to Ride Sharing Works for Austin, but it seems like something both parties should field. If Prop 1 fails, if Uber and Lyft do leave the city, that means a bunch of, presumably thousands of part-time temporary work out of the city. What do you think those companies would say to their drivers when they leave, if they decide to leave?
Well, again, I just want to point out that every time they've said they're going to leave, they have done it. So I think that we should all begin to come to terms with that fact. Second of all, they have worked very hard and been very clear that they oppose fingerprint background checks, because even the White House has said that introducing additional levels of licensing creates severe economic barriers to employment for several important communities. And that includes communities of color and the poor. And those are the people who are being priced out of Austin every single day when 115 new people and 75 new cars come to this city. And Uber and Lyft have, and ride-sharing companies have, for the first time in generations, found a way to make good economic opportunities available to people very quickly And we shouldn't change that, because there are times when your rent goes up $300 for the third year in a row, and you have to figure out where you're getting the extra $300. That happens to friends of mine who drive for ride-sharing companies, and that's why they're able to afford to stay in Austin.
Thank you.
Uber Corporation has recently invested in people developing driverless car technology. And a lot of insiders in the company have admitted that their ultimate goal is to be able to operate without drivers. This is another example of the soul of Uber Corporation is that they don't like to pay taxes in the United States. They have a shell corporation in Bermuda. All of their profits go there. Less than 2% of their net income is subject to taxation by the United States government. This is not a warm, comforting, and public-spirited organization. It's a ruthless, amoral organization driven by profit at the expense of safety.
Thank you.
All right, we got another question from our audience here. I'd like to ask. It seems like, and this is directed first at our city, our safety, our choice, and I'd also like to get Ride Sharing Works for Austin's take on this. Question from the audience. It seems like dozens of other cities have figured out how to regulate TNCs. Why do you think Austin is having such a tough time?
There's a public safety standard that our council is committed to. You know, Mayor Anise Parker wrote a really interesting letter talking about how things worked out in Houston, and talking about in Houston, you know, Uber was growing and there was a good partnership because they were able to really work through the initial fingerprinting startup for all the folks. And she repeatedly says in her letter, in Houston, we're not willing to compromise public safety. And I think that we have the same commitment among our council members. The bottom line is this council worked and worked and worked trying to find compromises where Uber and Lyft would be comfortable. And frankly, some people thought maybe they went too far. But the fact of the matter is this council tried very, very hard, and it was the stubborn position, but they're not willing to compromise safety.
Ride Sharing Works.
When I attended Mayor Adler's State of the City address, he spoke a little bit about the growing pains that this new city council has faced. And I'll be the first person to tell you, I actually really love our city council. We have some amazing members who work incredibly hard to represent their districts very well. Almost to a member. And I think that it's unfortunate that this has all blown up the way that it has, but it's important to remember that the initial ordinance that we've been operating under, it didn't just happen overnight. You know that very well, Councilwoman Morrison. It took 4 months of negotiations through an advisory board that included the TNC companies, it included the taxi cabs, it included the shuttle services, it included citizens. It went through a very contentious process, as you pointed out, and it was hashed out over 4 months, and it passed 6-1. And I think that it is instructive that former Mayor Lee Leffingwell has stood up in support of this particular ordinance, because he knows firsthand that it helps save lives.
And Austin's not unique. This is a fight that's happening between taxi cab companies and ride-sharing apps all across the country and all around the world.
So this next question also comes from an audience member, and I'm going to give this to Ride Sharing Works first. I think this number quoted here is coming from a recent BuzzFeed article. So the question posed by the audience member is, can you comment on the 11,000 sexual assault cases in Uber's customer complaint database? And I will tack on another question to that, which is what, our education reporter Kate McGee did a story a few months ago about 7 reported sexual assaults by Uber and Lyft drivers. What are the companies doing to better prevent these assaults and other crimes being committed by drivers?
So when I ran for, some of your listeners may know I recently ran for state representative, and I was the only candidate in that race to talk about sexual assaults, to talk about concrete policy positions that could be taken to reduce sexual assaults. For example, at the University of Texas, 1 in 5 women will be sexually assaulted before they graduate. The numbers are much more underreported for men. And I think it's very insincere for people to argue that fingerprint-based background checks would reduce sexual assaults. I think it's offensive and it's insulting, and it's not a solution. It's a solution in search of a problem. And if we really wanted to crack down on sexual assaults, we could have a police liaison between the city of Austin, Austin Police Department, and the TNCs. We could have stronger amnesty laws for for victims who happen to be drinking underage or who were smoking a little bit of weed. There are concrete ways to tackle sexual assaults. This is not an honest way to approach that.
Our city, our safety, our choice.
And I'd just like to, again, please ask our audience to refrain from booing and applause. I know it's hard. I feel you, but if you could do that, we'd appreciate it. All right, our city, our safety, our choice. You have a minute to respond.
Thank you. There are many women leaders in this community have stepped out and said they're very, very concerned, and we need to have all the layers of safety that we can. In 2015, the numbers came out that there were 20 unwanted sexual contact reported from Uber and Lyft rides. And you need to keep in mind that there's also a study out from UT that estimates that only less than 10% of sexual assaults are reported. So it's a big problem, and we need to be able to add everything that we can to be able to make things as safe as possible.
I'm not going to use this as an opportunity to beat up on Uber and Lyft. There's no point in it. I mean, there's certainly been crimes that have been committed by taxi drivers. Let's just be honest here. The point is to make the whole system safer for taxi drivers, TNC companies, shuttles, limos, But these statistics are real. I read the BuzzFeed article.
Thank you.
I don't know yet.
Thank you, Dean.
This one is another fantastic audience question. I'll start off with Ride Sharing Works for Austin. What about the ADA community, that's the Americans with Disabilities Act community, disabled Americans? Can you explain exactly how Austin is better off with or without Uber and Lyft?
I'm actually really glad you brought up that question. Uber has a program called Uber. Yes, whoever asked that, thank you very much.
Give him the nod.
The ride-sharing services have accessible services that are available at the push of a button for the first time to thousands of people who need ADA assistance. They get a driver who's trained on how to help them, who cares about helping them, who will be there within 20 minutes, and it'll cost them less than $20. That is a tremendous improvement over the way that we have serviced the ADA community for generations in this country. And it's very important to me because my grandfather was paralyzed from the waist down. I know how hard it was in 1984 for him to get into a doctor's appointment. And here in Austin, a city this big where you could easily spend an hour traveling 10 miles, having someone who's there, who is kind, who is ready to help a person in an ADA situation is a huge deal, and it is a massive public good that has gotten grossly overlooked in this discussion.
Clearly in this town, we need more options, more transportation options that are ADA accessible, and it's great that TNCs are doing it. There's a requirement in the ordinance that they participate in some of that. And I think that the question to them is, why are they asking Austinites to do without their service? And the fact of the matter is, as I said before, if they leave, it's a lucrative market. We can depend on the law of supply and demand coming in and working through things.
Anything else to add? All right, this is a question directed at our city, our safety, our choice first, and we've received an audience question. Several members of the audience have asked this question in different forms, but basically, does Austin risk running away startup capital? In other words, scaring startups out of town if we regulate out Uber and Lyft? That's to you guys first.
Well, I can speak briefly to that. I know that there was a bit of a dust-up because one person said that they would stop investing or stop recommending an investment. That was one fund, but there were also responses from investors that came to that said, great, one less competitor for my investing. So, it's a thriving community here for investment, and I think that is not a consideration.
I think we're living in a capitalist society. And the response I heard around town was, what planet is that guy living on? If it's a good investment, we're going to make an investment. It's a great town. And majority opinion, overwhelming opinion in that community is that was just something that somebody threw out to try to influence the debate.
Response? You guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, Austin really prides itself as, a new tech city. We have a great computer science program at the University of Texas. My roommate just graduated from there, and he chose to stay in Austin to work at a local tech startup. what's fundamental here is that we're driving out Uber and Lyft. We're driving out Airbnb and HomeAway, whom I'm not going to defend because I do have some irks with them. The state legislature is being awful to Tesla in defense of automobile dealers. We're creating an environment that's over-regulatory, and that's not actually in the public interest.
Also, we're running the risk of being the only major American city without rideshare. And when the Smart City initiative is as important to us as it is, it's unacceptable that we would risk driving out a very safe, technologically driven method of transportation.
The next question, we've talked about it before, but the audience has handed in several variations upon it, so we want to revisit it. In this day and age of this post-Citizens United country that we live in, with millions of dollars and super PACs, billions, lots of money, corporate money affecting elections, should PACs be allowed to spend millions on a local ballot initiative? What message are we sending to corporate and special interests in town by basically allowing them to spend like sailors on leave on these elections? Ride-sharing works, please.
I support extensive ethics reform both in Texas and in Austin. I think that we have a lot of very problematic campaign finance laws, but I personally find it gravely offensive that we're framing this as a corporation attempting to buy an election, because I have a lot of respect for the voters in Austin. This is one of the smartest electorates in the country. Our voter participation rate is among the best in Texas. I believe that every voter deserves to have a choice on legislation that is this important, that impacts this many Austinites. And I think it's beyond insulting to the 65,000 people, more than have voted for any citywide elected official that I'm aware of, though I'm not exactly sure on that, but more than voted for Mayor Adler, for example, sign those petitions. And I think it's insulting to them to say that they've been snookered and that this is an attempt at a corporate takeover when we put it on the ballot. We are having a vote.
And I think we should be applying just as much scrutiny to lobbying, because lobbyists do the exact same thing and it's not as transparent. Ask the taxi cab companies.
Well, we do have some examples readily at hand of corporations buying local elections or using money to influence them. I believe you referred to former Mayor Leffingwell, who has come out in favor of ride shares for Austin. Yesterday, he was asked by the Austin American Statesman, are you being paid by Uber Corporation? And he said yes, but he declined to say how much. The truth is that not one mammalian life form in the Travis County donated to the Uber Lyft Ride Shares for Austin campaign. It was all corporate money. I totally agree with you guys. It needs to be regulated. It needs to be restricted. The Sierra Club has come out in favor of the against position because they have pointed out if this huge corporation succeeds in rewriting public safety laws, it's only a matter of time before other corporate special interests come into town and try to rewrite our public health laws, our zoning laws, and our environmental protection ordinances.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, we're wrapping things up now. We'll get to closing statements soon. One last question, kind of a fun one, hopefully. We'll see. So let's start with our city, our safety, our choice. Can you guys just talk briefly about what is your personal experience with ride-hailing companies such as Uber and Lyft? Have you used them? If so, do you use them frequently? Just kind of take a minute and talk to us about that.
I have not used a ride sharing. I have very limited transportation needs. I live very close to most of the places that I need to go, and so it just hasn't, transportation, I'm very fortunate, has not really been an issue for me.
Sure, my wife and my children have. You know, I use my bicycle and my car to get around and walk, but my wife and children have both used rideshare services.
Ride sharing works?
I'm one of maybe 5 people in Austin that has chosen to get by without a car. I use ride sharing or car sharing like Car2Go every day.
I got into this fight because I and my friends depend on ride sharing to get us around safely. I use Lyft and Uber, several times a week. And another thing to note, from another perspective, I just ran for state representative. It was a 3-month race, and I didn't have any means of income. I was running against 6 very affluent attorneys whom I love and respect. But come March 1st, after I lost that race, I needed to pay a student loan bill and I needed to pay rent. So I signed up to drive for Lyft during South by Southwest, and I made good money doing it. And that's another thing we need to consider. It's not just great for passengers, it's also working for drivers in this community.
All right, we're going to move on to our closing statements now. You each have 2 minutes to provide a closing statement, and because Ride Sharing Works for Austin gave the opening statement, is that right? We're gonna begin with Our City, Our Safety, Our Choice. You have 2 minutes.
Well, thank you all for being so interested in this. It's really been, it's an interesting time in Austin, Texas, having this conversation. And I just want to go back to what the really big picture is here. We know that fingerprinting adds an important layer of safety. And so what we're looking at here is a question of whether we're going to, who's going to control the city. Is it going to be the citizens, or is it going to be corporations that are operating in their own self-interest? And make no mistake about it, this is a David and Goliath fight that's going on here. And it's important that everybody pay attention and have these discussions, so I appreciate it. But it's very unfortunate that we have millions being poured in by multi-billion-dollar corporations using misleading advertising to end up with, to address a very, very critical question for the people of Austin. So I hope and I urge you all to vote against Prop 1.
Well, urban politics in America began in bars and saloons, and I'm happy it's returning to its roots here tonight. This is not a fight that is confined to Austin. If you start Googling it, it's going on all over the country. Google's battling jurisdictions and cities and counties all over America to determine the amount of regulation. Their preferred mode of attack is to obey nothing and not follow the law at all and just do business. It's kind of a return to robber baron capitalism. But let's get back to the essential fact. It is astonishing that millions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of words are being spent over one essential issue, the city's right to regulate ride shares and this issue of fingerprinting, which everybody agrees does make background checks safer. Why, other than corporate arrogance or some sort of bottom line concern, would a major corporation oppose adding that to the package of background checks?
Thank you very much, sir. Ride Sharing Works for Austin. You have 2 minutes.
I'm sorry, not everybody agrees that fingerprinting makes it safer, and not everybody agrees that we should accept discrimination, towards those ends, because fingerprinting is discriminatory. Y'all, I'm voting for Prop 1 because ride sharing keeps me and my friends safe. It keeps our community safe. It provides supplemental income for so many Austinites in our community. I'm voting for Prop 1 because this is not an honest debate about public safety. If it were, we would be mandating that cab companies use the very awesome technologies that Uber and Lyft use to keep their passengers safe, such as GPS tracking in their vehicles, such as just knowing who your driver is going to be. The effect of voting no on Prop 1 will be that Uber and Lyft will be forced out because we're creating a regulatory climate that is too onerous for them, and that's not actually in the best public interest. This isn't about regulation versus non-regulation. This is about good, strong, sensible regulations that were passed by the 2014 council versus new regulations that were proposed by taxi cab companies, not our transportation department, not anybody on staff at City Hall, but by a taxi lobby that does not work in the interest of the public. If you don't believe me, I encourage everybody to try an Uber or Lyft or a Get Me, over the next month before they vote, and then go try a taxi cab company.
And again, voting for Prop 1 is voting for the same national background checks that have been in place for 2 years here in Austin and have worked in 200 cities around the United States of America. I really don't think that it is up for debate that this system has worked in 200 cities. There are problems with the system, absolutely, but they are not as extensive as the problems with fingerprint-based background checks.
DWIs have been reduced by 23%, and we should take that into account. Vote for Prop 1.
All right. That concludes our debate on Proposition 1, dealing with ride-hailing in Austin, brought to you by KUT News and the Austin Monitor. We're going to post this debate on our website, KUT.org. Early voting on this ballot proposition begins Monday, April 25th. Election Day is May 7th. Hey, let's give our panelists a round of applause. From Ride Sharing Works for Austin, Huey Ray Fisher and Joe Bowen. From Our City, Our Safety, Our Choice, Laura Morrison and Dean Rindy. For Kayla Pritchard with the Austin Monitor and KUT's Audrey McGlinchey, I'm Nathan Bernier. Thank you so much for listening.